There was a lot of work to be done, though, and as a result of this huge firstly, the huge population was the army. 800,000 men, 4 field armies worth of what were the partisans by the time they finished the war. So that was a huge number of men and material who could be directed into rebuilding the state. But a lot of people in the country, across the country, volunteered to support, young people particularly, volunteered to support this project to create a new state, this new model state, socialist Yugoslavia. So a huge amount of construction work was happening, roads particularly, but also railways, as we will describe. But housing too, New Belgrade there in the bottom corner, just an enormous effort to reconstruct a country, build a new nation, and industrialize. There's a 5-year plan to industrialize Yugoslavia. But we have to talk about railways. We have to talk about the Yugoslav railways, the Jugoslovenska Železnica, that's in Serbo-Croat. There was a tremendous effort to expand the railway network, expand the standard gauge railway network across Yugoslavia as part of this industrialization, because the need to move goods across the country meant there was a need for an expansion of the railways. And so we saw an enormous effort of the construction of new railways. In 1946, only a year after the Second World War ended, we saw a 100-kilometre railway being constructed between Brčko and Banovići, kind of connecting, basically joining the dots between industrial areas, a lot of them in the mountains. So you can see, in fact, that in the background, the little faded background map, the big gap in the railway network was in the big mountainous area, kind of in the heart of Yugoslavia. 1947, we saw this expansion of another 250 kilometres of railway being built between Šamac and Sarajevo, kind of paralleling a former narrow gauge railway-ish, but connecting up to the main line up between Zagreb and Belgrade. 1948, another 112 kilometres of railway between Bihać and Knin over in Croatia, kind of shortening the journey down to the coast substantially from up in Zagreb. At this point, it's worth saying that there was, people often assume that Yugoslavia was a communist state as part of the Eastern Bloc associated with the USSR. That is not the case, and hardened by the fact that there was a split between Tito and Stalin. Stalin had sent several assassins to try and kill Tito, and allegedly a letter was sent back by Tito saying the following: "If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second." I mean, this period was up to this point, and kind of up to 1948 and a little bit beyond, in fact, was known as the Informbüro period, and it was a pretty paranoid period. Let's not claim that at the start of the creation of any state, but particularly a socialist one that had so much split, this ethno-nationalism that had been one of the resistance forces, had obviously built a huge amount of resentment, and it comes back to this friction that I talked about at the start of the segment. There's this idea of the Greater Serbia, Serbs for Serbs, versus the broader Yugoslav project and the kind of the pan-national, pan-ethnic project, and this friction that existed. Tito held it together. Jump forward to 1966, so kind of well beyond the first one or more of the 5-year plans. New railway was extended. This is a fantastic railway, by the way, between Sarajevo, Mostar, and Ploče on the coast. Another 200 kilometers of railway. It wasn't just new railways being built, lots of electrification was going on, a 25 kV overhead electrification. So in this case, in 1970, that electrification expanded from Zagreb to Belgrade, kind of creating kind of a pretty fast intercity mainline, really, between the two cities. And then in 1976, by the way, as I'll talk about momentarily, to split into several sections that had been under construction since the late 50s. In 1976, the completed Belgrade-Bar Railway was opened, adding another 500 kilometers of railway. So by 1976, just looking at these major projects alone, ignoring some of the smaller railway projects, just these major projects alone, well over 1,123 kilometres of new railway being built. So an enormous amount of new railway constructed. And if I flick between kind of the old map and the new map, you can see some of the other bits of railway that were existing there, and some that still remain. Actually, this is the electrification one, so you can see the different types of electrification up in Slovenia, which had a different electrification system. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't all sunshine and roses, though. You can see the enormous economic growth that, highlighted in orange here, the enormous economic growth that happened in Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, through the 50s, through the 60s, and indeed through the 70s. Tito died in 1980. The country had been a meat grinder for Nazis, and as a result, its infrastructure, what little infrastructure it had as a not hugely developed country, had been smashed to bits, and it required an enormous effort to rebuild. As was the case in lots of other situations across Europe with Marshall Plan funding, the US started to flex its imperial muscles by calling for liberalization, capitalization, and the sort of dismantling of the socialist state. Otherwise, it would call in its debts. And this, funnily enough, wrecked the economy of made an absolute mess of the economy of socialist Yugoslavia. There were other things going on, frankly. There were other issues going on, but a core problem was the need for austerity, the need for market liberalization called for by Yugoslavia's debtors, most of the US. This then spread inequality, because if you do austerity, that means you're spreading inequality. Inequality spreads resentment, which fomented substantial ethnic dissatisfaction across a pretty diverse country. And we know what the consequences of that were, or hopefully everyone watching this is aware of the consequences of what that were, because Yugoslavia disintegrated in civil war. The economy of the country went to hell, and so too did the railways. So, from the point where we had, these wonderful sort of is one of the express diesel trains pulling trains around, to that same, and indeed Tito's blue train, to the kind of being decay. I think these two pictures sort of summarize the state of the railways in what is left of Yugoslavia.